Alrighty, gang. Second video for week 4, which is the first week of our second unit, and that's called Formal and Explicit Persuasion. We just covered Brockreedy and Enninger on Toulmin, the importance of the warrant, the importance of the kind of dynamic model of warrant establishing arguments as being very much about rhetoric and persuasion. And now we're turning to an essay by Charles Woolbert called The Place of Logic in a System of Persuasion. So again, this first week or this unit is about formal and explicit forms of persuasion. So we're thinking about arguments, we're thinking about logic, and as this piece tells us, that is the most explicit form of persuasion that we can find, is like rigorous analysis of connections and how things relate together. But this Woolbert essay is quite interesting, and it takes us in a unique direction. I got to admit, I've never taught or even read this until today. I scanned through it when I put it on the syllabus, and it looked quite interesting, and I'm glad I did put it on there. There's some really fascinating stuff in here, and it's a really interesting way of approaching this question of logic or an argumentation from a kind of deeply rhetorical and deeply persuasive psychological kind of angle. So I'm vibing with this, and the thing that's really blowing me away is the date of publication here, which is 1918. We're going back over a century. We're leaping past the last reading by about 4 decades. Charles Woolbert was one of the founders of the field of communication studies as we know it today. Before that came along, there was basically just like English literary kind of departments, and there was rhetoric taught alongside theater, because coming out of the 18th and 19th century, rhetoric was often smashed together with elocution, and even as basically as a form of acting, right? And so thanks to Woolbert and a few others, we now have the field that, houses our Department of Communication Studies, or this national organization called NCA, which used to be called SCA, Speech Communication Association. And even when I came into grad school, back in 1997 was when I started at Department of University of Illinois. Most departments in communication were called speech communication. So I went to University of Illinois to study rhetoric in a Department of Speech Communication, and interestingly, this is where Charles Woolbert himself once presided, and we had a computer lab that was called the Woolbert Lab, and that's where the grad students would go to answer their emails and print off their papers at the time. So Charles Woolbert's a really important figure, inaugural figure for this whole enterprise of communication studies. We no longer call things speech comm, we just call them comm. That's how much things have evolved. Even in my own fairly short time in this discipline, a couple decades, it started out as speech, and now no one really talks about speech except in very kind of specific ways. So we've broadened and we've moved on, but Woolbert was an important part of getting the ball rolling back 100 years ago. And I think you can get a sense of his significance here. This essay is pretty wild, and he's doing an even more radical intervention than Toulmin did. So exactly 4 decades later was when Toulmin's use of argument came out, 1958. So 4 decades prior to Toulmin, you've got Woolbert saying some pretty radical things here about logic and how the mind works and the relationship between body and brain, and this question of desire. It's really interesting stuff. So let's go ahead and launch in. I know this is a longer reading than the last one, but it's also like short amount of text on each page. And I'm not going to dwell on every section here. I just want to hit, again, important themes, important concepts, and there's a couple of really key moments that I wanted to drill down on. And I think this essay really nicely corresponds with the one by Brockreedy and Enninger. It corresponds really nicely with Aristotle. It nicely anticipates what we're going to be reading from Burke on form, as about having to do with desire and satisfaction. So there's a lot of resonance coming out of this piece, and I think it's quite a trip. So first page, again, notes right here, so I'm going to go with the notes. And right off the bat, first page, first sentence, he mentions psychology, right? And so Up until the early to mid part of the 20th century, as I mentioned in the last video, the study of argumentation and logic was something that was quite divorced from the body, right? It's something that really is like this kind of, this goes back to Descartes. If you've studied any Descartes at all, he was the one who said, I think, therefore I am. And so for a couple of hundred years, mental operations took precedence over bodily operations, and Descartes actually thought that there was like a pretty important separation between body and brain, right? And so logic and reasoning and the study of rhetoric was kind of set aside from reasoning, because rhetoric is very much about, you know, how we feel things and moving people around in irrational ways, right? And logic was kind of separated, and argumentation was separated, and it became this really intricate, formal, mathematical, highly abstract, highly technical kind of enterprise. And it's in the 20th century that we start to kind of muddy the waters, and I didn't realize that, you know, that something came out as early as 1918 by such a major figure was already starting to do that. This is really cool, because what he's doing is he's rejecting this Cartesian body-mind separation argument. He starts off right off the bat by saying, look, man, everything that we think about and all of our mental operations are first and foremost neuro-muscular operations, right? Everything that we think about is coming through the body, through the senses. And even our mental operations are themselves physical bodily operations. So logic is always already physiological. That's pretty wild, radical statement. I don't think I've seen anything as radical coming from such an early voice. Because again, there was always this assumption that we have reason over here and we have emotion over here. And he's saying reason is emotion. Reason's always emotion. It's always infused with sensation and feeling, and you know, how we encounter the world is through our senses, and that drives everything that we think about. We cannot separate. Even though we can get to a point of doing rigorous, analytical, investigative, focused kind of analysis, the way we talked about this in a previous week with the central and the peripheral, that was Perloff? Was that Perloff? Dude, come on, focus. Is very recent. Anyway, the central route and the peripheral route. The central route is all about the rigorous, deliberate analysis, and peripheral stuff is about quick, immediate, right? He's essentially talking about the same stuff. Instead of two paths or two routes, he's talking about three levels, but largely the same kind of stuff. And he's adding a third dimension here, but it's all very, very similar. So that's pretty wild. And so he's rooting logic in experience, and he's rooting logic in felt experience and lived experience and the physiology of kind of our everyday life. He's not saying logic is a kind of abstract reflection on this and always and forever is separate from how we live. He's saying, no, it's deeply connected to every moment that we live and how we perceive the world. And inferences is the important kind of consideration here. So we just finished talking about inference with Toulmin and his relationship to Aristotle, all going back to Aristotle and the enthymeme, and how we're constantly building arguments based on inferences that we make. There's so much work that happens, mental work, cognitive work is happening at a level below conscious, deliberate, formal processing, right? So much of how we perceive and how we receive the world is coming at a low level of consciousness and still matters and still is doing important intellectual, cognitive, analytic work that bubbles up into arguments, that bubbles up into persuasion. So he's acknowledging his indebtedness to psychology, and he's pushing the field further in this direction of thinking about the actualities of how it is messages come at us and how we process and receive them and send them out in turn. So logic for Woolbert is inferential. It's rooted in inferences, and inferences are rooted in experience itself, lived bodily sensation, moment-to-moment kinds of encounters with the outside world. That's what logic is all founded on. And so he wants to kind of level this out and see what's going on. So number 4, that wow moment is definitely there, right? So actually 3. All our activities in unconscious logic, even when we think it's not there, absolutely. Number 4, mental processes of all kinds are neuromuscular. All mentality comes from or is nervous activity affecting the muscles of the body. This is huge. Think about the relations between what we call reason and what we call feeling. How good it feels to make a sound argument. I thought I had come up with something completely brilliant about a year or so ago when I was talking to a colleague, and we were playing around with this idea of like the satisfaction of reason, the feeling of reasoning. Right? And we often think of reasoning as divorced from feeling. It's something that we do, and it's just strict and objective. And yet there is an affective dimension. There's a feeling dimension to it. If you come up with a really sound argument, it feels good. This is anticipating Burke on form again. This idea of satisfaction. There's something to do with feeling and mental powers when we feel satisfied at having made a good argument or having encountered a good argument. He wants to realize that these things really do go together, right? And that's important. Number 5, for every act of perception, of understanding, of cognition, of belief, of conviction is a process of this subconscious making of inferences and judgments. Judgments are quick decisions, right? Or quick evaluations that we're making. Inferences are guesses, right? And so we're always doing this. We're guessing, we're inferring. We're trying to figure out if do I turn left here, or is there a car coming, or is there a kid coming? There's a school zone over there. I better slow down, even if there's no sign, because I'm inferring that there might be kids playing based on the time of day, based on other cues in my surroundings. Inference. We're making so many decisions and judgments at a low level all the time. And what's cool about this Woolbert essay is he's saying that stuff matters, and it's also logical, and it's part of what we consider to be the business of communication in a rational way, right? So the levels. He gets into the levels on page 25. Do make sure that you're kind of good on what these levels are about. But the basic characteristics of the levels are, again, get back to, I wish I could remember. Elaboration likelihood, I think, was where we talked about that. That's Perloff, where he talked about the central processing and the peripheral processing. So in the case of Woolbert, central would be the top level, the open level. So Woolbert's going to start at the bottom with the unconscious. That's the first level. And that's the level of everyday, that's peripheral for Perloff, right? That's just automatic. What does he say here? Covert, subconscious, elemental, all-pervading, experiential, and also private. This is my subjective encounter with the world. And yet I'm still always processing, inferring, making judgments, right? It's me going to get coffee. It's me going to work. It's me going out on date night, processing the world, experiencing, interpreting, reasoning, da-da-da-da. It's always happening to all of us. And so it's cool that he's thinking that the private kind of experience of the world is part of our general processing of messages and how we create them and how we receive them. Next up, we've got the semi-open. This is interesting, right? Because with Perloff, we got the central and the peripheral, and that's pretty much it. Here we got the covert, which would be peripheral, and the open, which would be central. And then we get a third one, though, which is semi-open. Partially aware, verbal, personality-driven, prestige and testimony. So he's going to say that this is the level that is most open and susceptible to personalities, to authorities. And this is where leaders, teachers, coaches, experts, voices of authority, voices of prestige are hugely influential here, right? That's quite interesting. So this is kind of where ethos kicks in. I think maybe, not to complicate too much, but I think that first level is more about pathos, right? It's more about our kind of subjective interaction with the world. The next level seems to be more about ethos, authoritative, and then the last level, the top level, the open level, he's calling this the open level. That's the established rules of logic and reasoning. There we go. Now we seem to be at the level of logos. So I wonder if that's an interesting way of thinking about Aristotle's three modes of appeal. We just talked about that with the Toulmin piece in terms of the authoritative, the motivational, and the substantive. Now here he's suggesting that those things are operating on kind of levels of consciousness. The bottom level is the motivational or the pathos level. The next level, the semi-open, is the authoritative or the ethos level, and then the top level is the substantive or logos level. That's interesting. There could be something to that, because obviously logos is where we're really trying to think hard about connections in the world, causal connections, generalizations, part, whole, parallels, sequences, right? But in order to see that stuff, we kind of have to squint, and that's the central processing, and it's open, and it's public, and it's open to scrutiny of others. All of this stuff seems to kind of resonate pretty well together. So those are the three levels, and and he also said private and public, semi-private, semi-public in the middle, right? So that's interesting. So we're also moving from the subjective down below to the objective and public at the top there. It all seems to work pretty well here. I'm persuaded. The logical formulae kicks in around functions of the three levels. I've asked you to pay attention to that. Number 7 is to take a close look at the functions of the three levels. That's interesting and good. Helps clarify things, I think. The next section isn't quite as satisfying, but it's still interesting. The logical formulae of the three levels. All right, so if we have these three levels and they're all logical, because he's already said all of this stuff is relevant to the study of logic, so then there should be logical formulae or regulations or guidelines or protocols. This is number 8 on the page here. The first one, the covert level, the formulae for the logical formula would be rhetoric itself in terms of style and eloquence, right? And so you think about, he talks about the vividness of language, word choice, and how that conjures certain kinds of moods and images, right? So the relationship here between language and our subjective experience, the words, the sentences that best connect to my lived experience, that best resonate. That's rhetoric understood as that kind of, that pathos-driven job of appealing to the senses, appealing to the imagination, of appealing to the whole self of the audience in terms of their experience, in terms of their drives and moods and so on. To the extent that language can get at that and convey that and connect that, it's working logically, which is also rhetorically, which is also stylistically. I hope that all kind of lines up and makes sense to you. The semi-open formulae would be attached to the dictates of prestige, he says, and authority and character in that sense. And he basically admits that we don't know enough about this and what governs that. But we do respond to authorities. We do respond to prestige, right? We do respond to people who, again, this is semi-public and semi-private. So these could be public figures, but they could be, church members or like leaders in our church or leaders in our cosplay group or whatever. In our private life, we have people who rise to the top and kind of influence us, and that's the realm of prestige and testimony that he talks about in terms of, again, the rules that drive the logic at these levels. And then, of course, the open level, the top level, the central processing level, that's just, go consult all the textbooks on logic that we have, right? So there is where all that logo stuff, and it's a whole world of it, and it's maddening and difficult, but sure enough, we have the ability to think rigorously about logical relations and what goes with what and what's valid and invalid and how all that kind of reasoning works, right? And that's the most open level, that's the most public level, and that's the level that we can go into a classroom and diagram things out and talk about, is this logical, is this not logical? But the point is that that's not the only level of logic that we can talk about. He's talking about logic at each level, at the private level, at the semi-private level, right? Quite interesting. And what carries through all of it is inference and judgment. Quite interesting. All right. Pay special attention to the section on 35 is the 9th note here. Let's see, what do we got? Oh yeah, the motive power of inference. Things get really interesting right toward the end here. Basically, what drives everything, right? He's saying that logic permeates everything that we do. Every moment of our lives, there's a kind of logical operation, and it's being driven by inference and judgment, right? And what's driving that is this business of, he says at the bottom of 35, whence do inferences arise? So inferences characterize all of our kind of logical operations at every level. But what drives inferences? Well, the top of 36, he says, I referred to what Freud calls the wish. What are we doing here? 20 minutes, good. Everything we do is the result of a wish, either hidden from sight in the subjective processes or, in words, objectively in the open. So our personal wishes are like, I don't know, status, success, love, desire, attraction. Like, these are basic kind of motives that drive all of the inferences we make. I'm hungry, I'm broke, I need more money, I got to go get more money, more status, more maybe power, on and on and on, right? But then we can also talk about objective public wishes, right? Like safety, similarity, we have shared goals, beauty could be one for us as a community, as a public, success, growth, and on, right? Interesting how desire, the wish, what we want, what we long for, again, operates at all of these different levels. So the wish is the engine that runs the motor of life, and every being has its quota of big and little wishes. Wow, quite a grand statement, but also I think quite profound. Desire, wishing, longing, yearning. These are what drive all of the things that we do and engage in. Even a war, even the war in Ukraine, that's rooted in Putin's wish for something, for a world that no longer exists. Even at that scale. I was just watching the recent Thor movie. It finally came to Disney. Love and Thunder. Great performance by Christian Bale. It's kind of a weird movie. Don't need to give you my review, but at the end of it, you have that moment where the hero and the antagonist are like finally doing their battle and their confrontation, and it ends up resolving itself in an interesting way because Thor is saying to this sad guy who lost his daughter and this god did nothing for him, what is his wish? To be loved, to be with his daughter. He's longing to be with his daughter. Wishing, desiring is what drives everything. All of our human adventures and our enterprises and our schemes, it's all driven by the wish. And that's quite profound, I think. Next 2 paragraphs down, he says, the point to this seeming digression comes in this. It is the wish that motivates inference and judgment. Inferences are hardly made out of blue sky. They are forced upon us. Every inference arises because we are pleased to make it. We believe it because we want to. We respond in a given way because that is the way we are heading. So to speak of levels of inference is also to speak of levels of openness in wishing. Dang. And then the last final thing that he says that's quite profound, and it comes and goes quickly, but it's a whopper, is this idea of fallacies. We're not going to talk at great length about fallacies. This is not an argumentation class, but I think you probably have some sense of what a fallacy is. Maybe you even know some. Maybe you took some in a philosophy class or an argument class of some kind. A fallacy is basically a like, no, you did something wrong in your reasoning, right? And he's saying that fallacies are just our bad wishes, are acting on bad wishes and bad impulses. There's the fallacy of the ad hominem. It's an attack. You're going at the person. Well, you would say that because you're a Democrat. Or you would say that because you're from Ohio. Imagine. That's an ad hominem attack. And what it's doing is it's venting a wish, a bad wish, right? It's quite profound what he's saying here. He's like the last point, number 11 here on the page. He calls fallacies the names we give to bad wishes. Like name calling or ad hominem attacks is a bad wish to smear someone we don't like. We often want to act on our bad impulses, to name call, to slander. Fallacies are just basically saying like, whoa, hold those bad wishes in check. That's not how we should be operating. Now think about the levels again. The bottom level is the private level. We indulge our bad wishes all the time. And so we, in our interpersonal private conversations, we probably engage in fallacies quite a bit. Doesn't mean that it's okay. It just means that it's pretty normal, right? But at the level of the public and the open, we should be trying to refrain from name calling and from hasty generalizations. Like, being discriminatory is basically a hasty generalization. You're a this, oh, that means you're a this, right? That's a generalization where you're working from a small sample and you're broadening it out. Well, that's not a great move to make because there's all kinds of exceptions that we can imagine, right? And we are all exceptions to, the generalizations that we make about each other. So that really hit me. This idea that, what does he say here in 37? All fallacies in reasoning reveal attempts to supplant a wish of which we are ashamed by one which we think will be more socially acceptable. So fallacies are calling out our moments of succumbing to bad wishes. Every fallacy that is given a name in the textbooks can be shown to be the outcropping of a suppressed wish. Fallacies are the unwitting disclosures of hidden wishes. Wow. I think it's brilliant. All right, so the key takeaways here are the fact that, logic permeates all, and that it's this business of inference and judgment, and that is being driven by our wishes and our desires. And it's operating at private subjective level, it's operating at a semi-public, semi-private level, and it's also operating at an open public level. And we can talk about logic at each of these levels, and they kind of operate slightly differently, but they are always operating. And I think that's a really great way to kind of move forward. This is the unit where we're supposed to be talking about explicit and formal operations of persuasion. Here he's saying, yes, but it's still also implicit and informal, and logical operations are taking place even when we're not quite aware of them, right? And so this is a really cool way of broadening the field of logic and the field of argumentation to make it somewhat more coterminous with persuasion and rhetoric more broadly. So it's a good move for rhetoric to kind of like to sort of basically tell the logicians, hey gang, stop being so stodgy and fuddy-duddy, because what you're doing, or what matters here in terms of what you're studying, is what we're all doing all the time over here in rhetoric, which is also deeply physiological and deeply psychological and deeply subjective, and is happening kind of all the time, right? So it's best to be kind of aware of these different levels and how logic and inference making and judgment and wish seeking is happening constantly. All right, that's plenty. Fascinating start to this unit. As always, if you have questions, do reach out, and we'll see you moving forward.